Before this story begins, let me ask you for something simple. If you haven't already, take a second and subscribe to this channel. Not because these stories are dramatic. Not because they are meant to shock or tempt you to stay for a few minutes. But because they are honest. What you hear here is not fiction designed to entertain and disappear. These are reflections of real lives, real choices, real mistakes, and emotions people rarely admit out loud. If you've ever felt lonely while standing in the middle of your own home, if you've ever felt unseen by the person who promised to know you best, if you've ever ignored a quiet voice inside you because listening to it felt too dangerous, then listen carefully. This story is for you. Because no one wakes up one morning and decides to ruin their life. No one opens their eyes and thinks, today I will become the villain in someone else's story. And yet, that is exactly how it happens. Not through intention, but through moments. Some stories don't begin the way people expect them to. They don't open with betrayal. They don't start with whispered lies or secret messages hidden behind locked screens. They don't announce themselves with shouting matches, slammed doors, or broken vows. Some stories begin much more quietly. They begin with silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the silence that rests gently on your shoulders at the end of a long day. But the heavy kind. The kind that presses against your chest when you realize that two people can share the same roof and still live in completely separate worlds. Life has a cruel habit of disguising its turning points as ordinary days. They don't arrive with dramatic music or clear warnings. They don't pause time and tell you, pay attention. This is where everything changes. They slip into your life quietly. They blend in. They feel harmless. And only later, much later, do you understand that nothing has been the same since. The day Ethan came back into my life was exactly like that. It was an ordinary afternoon. The kind that disappears from memory before the sun even sets. Soft sunlight filtered through thin curtains, catching tiny particles of dust in the air. They floated slowly, lazily, as if even time itself had decided not to rush. The house was quiet. But it wasn't peaceful. There's a difference between silence that soothes and silence that weighs on you. This was the second kind. The kind that exists when connection has faded, but habit remains. My husband, Kareem, had already left for work. He always left early. Efficient. Focused. Distracted. Over the years, his responsibilities had grown. Or maybe they hadn't grown at all. Maybe they had simply replaced the space where intimacy used to live. That morning felt no different from any other. Except for one thing. Ethan was back. Ethan was Kareem's son from his first marriage. 25 years old. Intelligent. Quiet. He had the kind of presence that made you feel noticed without being watched. Observant. Thoughtful. Like someone who paid attention to details others missed, but chose not to comment on them. He had returned after a breakup. Not the dramatic kind. No screaming arguments. No explosive endings. Just the slow, hollow kind. The kind that empties you from the inside. Kareem mentioned it casually one morning, as if he were commenting on the weather. Ethan's going to stay with us for a while, he said, already scrolling through his phone. There was no discussion. No pause. No question about how I felt. No acknowledgement that the balance of our home was about to shift. And just like that, it did. At first, everything was polite. Too polite. Ethan and I moved around each other carefully, like strangers sharing borrowed space. Conversations were brief. Respectful. Neutral. Boundaries existed. Even if we never spoke them out loud. We both understood something instinctively. Too much familiarity could lead somewhere dangerous. He was kind but distant. I was courteous but guarded. Because peace in a household often survives on what goes unsaid. I told myself it was temporary. That he would heal. That he would leave. That nothing would change. I was wrong. That afternoon, I stood in my bedroom preparing for another formal gathering. Another obligation. Another performance. Kareem insisted we attend. Another event tied to work, appearances, and expectations. Dresses were scattered across the bed. One by one, I lifted them, examined them, and rejected them. Too tight. Too dull. Too unfamiliar. Each one felt like it belonged to someone I no longer recognized. Lost in thought, I didn't hear the door open. A voice broke the silence. Hair. The word stopped halfway. I turned. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway. For one suspended second, neither of us moved. Confusion crossed his face. Then embarrassment. Then panic. He turned away so quickly he nearly lost his balance. I'm sorry, he muttered, already pulling the door shut. And just like that, it was over. Nothing inappropriate happened. Nothing intentional. Nothing that could be explained out loud. But something shifted that I stood there, heart racing, face burning. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I told myself it was nothing. But deep down I knew better. From that moment on, Ethan's presence felt heavier. Not threatening, just noticeable. I became aware of his footsteps in the hallway. His voice drifting from another room. The spaces he occupied. And I hated myself for noticing. I hated how something so small could disturb the fragile order I had built around my life. Kareem noticed nothing. Ethan needs time, he said one evening, barely looking up from his phone. He'll stay as long as he needs. I nodded. I always nodded. Ethan listened more than he spoke. Where Kareem filled silence with schedules and obligations, Ethan respected it. Where Kareem spoke in absolutes, Ethan observed in questions. And that difference mattered more than I wanted to admit. One night, Kareem worked late. Ethan and I ate dinner together for the first time. Halfway through the meal, he spoke quietly. She left, he said. No bitterness. No anger. No drama. She found someone else. I offered sympathy. He accepted it with tired gratitude. Something softened between us. After that night, conversation came easier. Still careful. Still restrained. But honest. We avoided being alone together. Or at least, we tried. Avoidance has a strange way of drawing attention to exactly what it hides. One evening, Kareem called again. I'll be late. The house felt unnaturally quiet. Ethan sat on the couch, flipping through channels. Want to watch something? He asked. We sat far apart. Then, at the same moment, both our hands reached for the remote. They brushed. He pulled back instantly. It's fine, I said. But my voice betrayed me. Nothing happened. And yet, everything had already changed. This is how lives unravel. Not with dramatic choices, but with quiet ones. With moments that feel too small to matter. With silences that go unchallenged. Every step feels harmless when viewed alone. But together, they form a path you never intended to walk. And the most dangerous part? By the time you realize where it leads, turning back feels impossible. If this story resonates with you, stay with this channel. More chapters are coming. More truths that live in the quiet spaces people avoid. Because silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. Sometimes it means everything already has. After that night on the couch, nothing was openly different. That was the strange part. No words were spoken about what had happened. No glances held too long. No sudden closeness that could be questioned or explained. On the surface, life continued exactly as it had before. But beneath that surface, something invisible had begun to stretch between us. A space. Not distance. Awareness. I noticed it in small, humiliating ways. In how I paused before entering a room if I heard his voice inside. In how I adjusted my clothes when I knew he was nearby, not because I wanted his attention, but because I suddenly became aware of myself again. It terrified me. For years, I had moved through my own home without thinking about how I looked, how I sounded, how I existed. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being a woman and become a role. Wife. Host. Support system. Now, without warning, I felt seen again. And I hated myself for it that I began noticing differences I had never allowed myself to see. Kareem came home tired. Always tired. His phone never left his hand. Even when he spoke to me, his attention drifted elsewhere, like I was a task to be checked off rather than a person to be understood. Ethan, on the other hand, noticed things. He noticed when I was quiet longer than usual. He noticed when I skipped dinner. He noticed when I looked distracted, when my smile didn't reach my eyes. He never asked directly. And somehow that made it worse. Because asking would have given me a chance to deflect, to lie, to pretend everything was fine. His silence felt like permission. Or maybe like understanding. I didn't want that kind of understanding. And yet, I found myself craving it. Kareem's workdays stretched longer. Meetings. Deadlines. Travel. The house grew quieter in the evenings, and that silence changed shape. It no longer pressed down on me. Instead, it wrapped around us. Sometimes Ethan cooked. Simple meals. Nothing fancy. But he cooked with care, like the process itself mattered. We ate together at the kitchen counter, not the dining table. The dining table felt too formal. Too much like pretending. Conversation drifted easily. Books. Music. Places he wanted to visit but hadn't yet. Things Kareem never asked about. I told myself it was harmless. Just talking. Just company. Just two people occupying the same space. But I started looking forward to those evenings. And that frightened me more than anything else. Happened without drama. Without intention. One evening I laughed. A real laugh. The kind that surprises you because you forgot what it sounded like. Ethan looked at me, genuinely startled. I haven't heard that before, he said. Heard what? I asked. You, he replied. The word landed heavier than it should have. Not your voice. Not your laugh. You. Something in my chest tightened. I changed the subject. I always changed the subject. But later that night, lying beside Kareem as he scrolled through his phone, I realized something that made my stomach turn. I hadn't laughed like that in years. Guilt doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, disguised as self-awareness. I started correcting myself constantly, monitoring my tone, my posture, my words. I avoided eye contact with Ethan, then felt rude for doing so. I overcompensated with Kareem, asked about his day, initiated conversations he barely responded to. At night, I stared at the ceiling and tried to pinpoint the exact moment my life had begun to fracture. There was no single answer, just accumulation. Moments stacking on top of each other, too small to stop, too heavy to ignore. One afternoon, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. The sky darkened fast. Rain hammered against the windows. Thunder cracked so loudly it rattled the walls. The power went out. I stood in the hallway, momentarily unsure of where to go, when Ethan appeared with a flashlight. Breaker's fine, he said. Just the storm. We stood there in the dim light, shadows stretching across the walls. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air felt charged. Not with desire. With awareness. I'll light some candles, I said quickly. In the kitchen, our hands brushed again. This time, neither of us reacted immediately. Then he stepped back. I should give you space, he said. I nodded. Too quickly. Too eagerly. As if space was exactly what I wanted. That night, the rain didn't stop. Neither did my thoughts. I realized something then that scared me more than any physical line being crossed. The danger wasn't attraction. It was connection. The kind that grows quietly. The kind that fills emotional gaps you didn't even realize had formed. The kind that makes you feel alive again. And that realization came with a truth I didn't want to face. I wasn't falling toward Ethan. I was drifting away from my marriage. And the distance had started long before he ever walked back into my life.